For more than 30 years, solid-state batteries were always 5 years away. Now a small startup claims they're already shipping them, with no lithium, no cobalt, and a 5-minute charge. If that's true, the entire battery industry is already outdated. For years, solid-state batteries have been treated like the holy grail of energy storage. Safer than lithium-ion, faster to charge, longer lasting, and far more stable. On paper, they look like the obvious future. And yet, despite decades of research, not a single solid-state battery has made it into mass-produced vehicles that everyday customers can actually buy. That failure isn't because the idea is bad. It's because the physics are unforgiving. Traditional lithium-ion batteries rely on liquid electrolytes, flammable solvents that allow lithium ions to move between the anode and cathode. That liquid makes batteries powerful, but also dangerous. It's why thermal runaway exists, why fires spread so fast, and why extreme fast charging shortens battery life instead of extending it. Solid-state batteries promise to remove that liquid entirely and replace it with a solid electrolyte. In theory, that should solve almost everything. In reality, it introduces a new set of problems that are even harder to control. Most solid electrolytes are brittle. They crack under stress. And once microscopic cracks form, lithium dendrites can punch straight through them, causing sudden failure. This is where nearly every major company has hit the same wall. Toyota, Samsung, QuantumScape, all of them have shown impressive lab results. But scaling those results into real-world production has proven brutally difficult. Cells that work perfectly in controlled environments start breaking down once they're cycled thousands of times, exposed to vibration, temperature swings, and manufacturing imperfections. That's why solid-state batteries have stayed trapped in prototypes, timelines, and press releases. Always impressive, never shipping. And that history is exactly why the next claim changed everything. In early January 2026, a single statement quietly changed the conversation. A post appeared confirming that Donut Lab had already placed its solid-state batteries into production vehicles and shipped them to real customers. Not test rigs, not lab demos, actual vehicles on the road. That alone would have been enough to raise eyebrows. But the details that followed were what sent shockwaves through the industry. According to Donut Lab, their battery doesn't use lithium at all. No cobalt. No rare earth metals. Instead, it relies on a sodium-ion-based composition built around a solid-state architecture that is non-toxic and thermally stable by design. The company also claims the technology is fully scalable, not a fragile one-off engineered for headlines. Then came the numbers. A full charge in about 5 minutes. A lifespan rated at up to 100,000 charge cycles, potentially translating into decades of use. And an energy density figure that, if accurate, would place it well beyond today's best lithium-ion cells. If even a portion of those claims holds up, this isn't a marginal improvement or a clever chemistry tweak. It represents a complete break from the battery playbook the industry has relied on for more than 30 years. Entire supply chains would be affected. Mining priorities would shift. And years of lithium optimization would suddenly look less inevitable. That's why Donut Lab didn't just attract excitement. It attracted attention from the biggest names in energy storage. Companies like Toyota, Samsung SDI, and QuantumScape are now watching closely, even if they're careful about what they say publicly. Because breakthroughs don't announce themselves politely. They force everyone else to reassess their timelines. But bold claims invite an obvious question, and this one couldn't be ignored. Almost immediately after Donut Lab's announcement, a deeper and more uncomfortable debate began to spread through engineering circles. The question wasn't about cost, or scale, or even credibility. It was more fundamental than that. Is this device actually a battery at all? The skepticism didn't come out of nowhere. A 5-minute charge time and a claimed lifespan of 100,000 cycles are not traits normally associated with electrochemical batteries. They are the signature traits of capacitors. For anyone who has followed energy storage research long enough, those numbers trigger an instinctive reaction. Batteries degrade because they rely on chemistry that changes with every cycle. Capacitors don't, because they store energy physically rather than chemically. Traditional batteries work by pushing ions deep into electrode materials. During charging, ions migrate and embed themselves inside crystal lattices. During discharge, they exit again. That repeated insertion and removal slowly damages the structure. Microfractures form. Active material becomes inactive. Capacity fades. This is true whether the battery uses lithium, sodium, or almost any other ion. Degradation isn't a flaw in design. It's a consequence of the mechanism itself. Capacitors operate very differently. Instead of relying on ion diffusion into bulk material, they store charge on surfaces. There is no deep structural change taking place, which is why capacitors can charge almost instantly and survive millions of cycles with minimal wear. But this advantage comes at a steep cost. Energy density. Even the most advanced supercapacitors struggle to exceed 10 to 20 watt-hours per kilogram. They are excellent for bursts of power, not for sustained energy storage. That limitation has kept them out of electric vehicles and large-scale energy systems. This is why critics immediately raise the alarm. If Donut Labs' device behaves like a capacitor, then calling it a battery would be misleading. But this argument starts to weaken the moment energy density enters the discussion. Donut Lab claims an energy density of around 400 watt-hours per kilogram. That figure is not just higher than most lithium-ion cells on the market today. It is far beyond anything capacitors, even theoretical ones, are capable of achieving. Tesla's best cylindrical lithium-ion cells operate closer to 260 to 300 watt-hours per kilogram. LFP and sodium-ion chemistries sit even lower. If Donut Labs' numbers are accurate, this device cannot be a conventional capacitor, no matter how quickly it charges or how long it lasts. So how can something behave like a capacitor and still store energy like a battery? The answer may lie in a class of behavior that sits between the two, known as pseudocapacitive energy storage. In pseudocapacitive systems, ions don't penetrate deep into rigid crystal structures. Instead, they participate in fast surface-based redox reactions across massive internal surface areas. The energy is still stored chemically, but without the slow diffusion and structural damage that plague traditional batteries. This is where Donut Labs' references to amorphous ceramic materials become crucial. Crystalline solids, which dominate most solid-state battery research, have rigid atomic lattices. They crack under stress, especially when ions repeatedly enter and exit. Amorphous materials, by contrast, lack long-range order. Their atomic structure is disordered, flexible, and far more tolerant of repeated ion movement. Rather than fracturing, they deform and recover. Materials like titanium dioxide have long been studied in battery research, but they were historically dismissed because of their low operating voltage and limited energy density in conventional designs. However, when engineered into amorphous, nanostructured forms, those limitations begin to change. The material can host rapid surface reactions, tolerate extreme cycling, and maintain structural integrity far longer than crystalline alternatives. If Donut Labs' battery uses a solid-state architecture built around such materials, it would explain several otherwise contradictory claims at once. Extremely fast charging becomes possible because ions don't need to diffuse deeply. Long cycle life emerges because the structure isn't being torn apart with every cycle. And high energy density becomes achievable because the internal surface area is enormous, allowing a large number of reactions to occur simultaneously. This doesn't mean the technology defies physics. It means it operates in a regime that most commercial batteries have never occupied, one that blends characteristics of batteries and capacitors without fully becoming either. Of course, this interpretation doesn't prove Donut Labs' claims are true, but it does dismantle the idea that those claims are automatically impossible. The internal logic holds together in a way that pure hype usually doesn't. And yet, even if the chemistry makes sense on paper, credibility in this industry is earned visually. Which is why the next moment in this story sparked the most intense backlash of all. The most explosive moment in the entire Donut Lab story had nothing to do with chemistry, patents, or theoretical limits. It happened on the floor of CES 2026, in front of an audience trained by decades of disappointment to look for one thing above all else. Proof. Visitors expected to see a working cell, a live charge, a thermal test, something moving, heating, discharging, or powering a load in real time. Instead, what they found were carefully engineered modules, sealed housings, and polished enclosures. The hardware looked real. The claims sounded bold, but the battery itself remained out of sight. For an industry shaped by broken promises, that absence was impossible to ignore. Battery research has a long memory. Engineers still remember grand announcements that never survived independent testing. They remember prototypes that only worked under perfect conditions. They remember startups that vanished the moment scrutiny intensified. So when a company claims to be shipping a revolutionary battery, yet cannot publicly demonstrate a single active cell, alarm bells don't just ring. They echo. The reaction was immediate and emotional. Online discussions turned hostile. Comparisons to past technology scandals surfaced almost automatically, not out of malice, but because the pattern felt familiar. Revolutionary claims. Restricted access. No live demonstration. For many observers, the conclusion seemed obvious. If the technology were real, why hide it? But that question assumes the goal of CES was public persuasion. According to Donut Lab, it wasn't. From the beginning, the company positioned its CES presence as a controlled signal rather than an open reveal. Their stated objective was not to convince journalists or excite retail consumers, but to engage original equipment manufacturers already deep in battery validation programs. The audience they cared about wasn't walking the showroom floor with cameras. It was sitting behind NDAs. Donut Lab maintains that fully functional battery packs were already shipped before CES to selected OEMs and authorized research institutions. These partners, according to the company, are allowed to test performance metrics such as charging speed, cycle life, power delivery, and thermal behavior. What they are not allowed to do is open the cells or publicly disclose internal construction details. This distinction changes the nature of the controversy. The question shifts from whether the batteries exist to who is allowed to see them. From a strategic perspective, the decision begins to look less irrational. In battery development, exposure equals vulnerability. Reverse engineering isn't hypothetical. It's inevitable. The moment a competitor gains access to an internal structure, years of advantage can evaporate overnight. Even brief visual exposure can be enough to identify materials, layering techniques, and manufacturing shortcuts. Donut Lab's leadership openly acknowledged this risk. They don't deny that competitors will eventually buy vehicles using their batteries and tear them apart layer by layer. Their argument is simpler. Delaying that moment matters. In a field where supplier contracts, licensing deals, and manufacturing partnerships move slowly, a few weeks or months of head start can reshape an entire market. That doesn't mean secrecy is harmless. It carries its own cost. Every day, without independent public verification feeds skepticism. But secrecy and deception are not the same thing. And companies planning to disappear rarely anchor their reputation to a timeline they can't control, which is exactly what Donut Lab did. The company publicly tied its credibility to upcoming third-party verification once NDA restrictions expire. That is a risky commitment if the technology doesn't perform as claimed. It's a bet that only makes sense if the results can survive external scrutiny. The CES backlash, then, may not be the smoking gun many assumed. It may simply be the collision between an industry desperate for proof and a startup trying to survive long enough to protect its breakthrough. And that tension only intensifies when you look at who Donut Lab is up against. Once the initial shock settled, the controversy took on a new form. The debate stopped being about chemistry and secrecy and shifted towards something even harder to accept. Scale. Donut Lab isn't a global conglomerate. It isn't backed by decades of institutional dominance. It's a small startup from Finland, reportedly operating with a technical team small enough to fit inside a single conference room. That reality alone triggered disbelief. For comparison, Toyota has spent decades pursuing solid-state batteries. Billions of dollars in funding. Thousands of patents. Entire research divisions dedicated to solving the problem. And despite all of that, Toyota still speaks cautiously about timelines, often pointing toward limited production later in the decade. Against that backdrop, the idea that a startup with a fraction of the resources could leap ahead feels almost insulting to common sense. But this reaction reveals more about our assumptions than about the technology itself. We tend to believe innovation scales linearly. More money, more people, more time should automatically produce better results. Yet history repeatedly shows that breakthroughs don't always come from the largest organizations. Lithium-ion batteries themselves didn't emerge fully formed from corporate labs. They grew out of specific material science discoveries, often made by small teams working on problems others considered impractical or uninteresting. Scale doesn't create chemistry. Scale industrializes it after the fact. Toyota's struggle with solid-state batteries has never been about whether the concept works. It's been about whether it can survive real-world conditions. Most solid electrolytes pursued by large manufacturers are crystalline. And crystalline materials, no matter how carefully engineered, are brittle. They crack under mechanical stress, vibration, and thermal cycling. Once cracks form, dendrites follow. Failure becomes inevitable. If Donut Labs' approach truly avoids crystalline structures altogether, favoring amorphous ceramics or nanostructured materials, then it may not have beaten Toyota at its own game. It may have bypassed the game entirely. That distinction matters. A different path doesn't require more funding. It requires different assumptions. Large organizations tend to optimize within known frameworks. They refine what already works. Startups, by contrast, can afford to pursue ideas that look inefficient, unorthodox, or even foolish, right up until they aren't. Many of the most disruptive technologies in history looked implausible precisely because they violated established trade-offs. This doesn't mean Donut Lab is guaranteed to succeed. Unconventional approaches fail far more often than they win. But when they do work, they tend to arrive suddenly and unevenly, creating the illusion that a small player somehow jumped years ahead overnight. What makes Donut Lab uncomfortable for industry leaders isn't that it claims to be better. It's that it may be operating under a different set of constraints entirely. And that discomfort grows stronger when the discussion turns to what's missing from the data. Even among researchers willing to entertain Donut Lab's unconventional approach, one omission continues to stand out. The company has been remarkably vocal about gravimetric energy density, measured in watt-hours per kilogram. But it has remained noticeably quiet about volumetric energy density, measured in watt-hours per liter. That silence matters more than it might seem. In electric vehicles, weight is important, but space is often the harder constraint. A battery that is extremely light but physically bulky can be workable in niche platforms, yet impractical in mass-market cars. Packaging dictates vehicle design. It affects cabin space, crash structures, cooling systems, and cost. Automakers care just as much about how much energy fits into a given volume as they do about how much it weighs. For electric motorcycles like the Verge models reportedly using Donut Labs batteries, this trade-off may be manageable. Motorcycles prioritize weight reduction aggressively, and their frame geometry allows more flexibility in battery shape. A slightly bulkier pack might be acceptable if it delivers extreme cycle life, fast charging, and thermal stability. Passenger vehicles are far less forgiving. If Donut Labs technology achieves its performance by maximizing internal surface area through nanostructured or amorphous materials, that structure could inherently consume more volume. Large surface area often comes at the cost of packing density. This would not negate the breakthrough, but it would redefine where the technology fits best. The important point is that this question cannot remain unanswered for long. OEM testing will expose volumetric limitations almost immediately. Automakers routinely tear down test packs, map internal geometry, and model how the system would integrate into existing vehicle platforms. If the volume penalty is too high, the technology will stall at motorcycles, industrial equipment, or stationary storage. If it's acceptable, even without being revolutionary, the implications remain enormous. This is why the industry's response has been cautious rather than dismissive. Toyota and others are not panicking because Donut Lab has already won. They're paying attention because the technology may still be disruptive even if it fails to check every box. A lithium-free, thermally stable, fast-charging energy system with extreme cycle life would reshape supply chains and risk models even if its volumetric density is merely competitive rather than dominant. And that brings the story to its most important point. Not what. So where does that leave Donut Lab? Right now, skepticism is not just justified, it's necessary. Extraordinary claims still demand extraordinary evidence, and Donut Lab has not yet released the kind of transparent, independently verified data the scientific community expects. That criticism is fair. The battery industry has seen too many revolutions promised and quietly forgotten to accept anything on faith. But skepticism is not the same as dismissal. When you strip away the hype and look at the internal logic of Donut Lab's claims, something interesting emerges. The story is no longer pure fantasy. There is a coherent material science narrative that connects fast charging, extreme cycle life, and solid-state safety without relying on impossible physics. Unconventional, yes. Unproven, absolutely. But no longer absurd. The coming months will decide everything. Once NDAs expire and third-party test results surface, the technology will either withstand scrutiny or collapse under it. There is no middle ground. And Donut Lab has publicly tied its reputation to that moment, a risky move for any company whose claims can't survive daylight. If the technology fails, the industry will absorb the lesson and move on, just as it always has. Another promised breakthrough added to a long list of forgotten headlines. But if it works, even partially, the implications reach far beyond a single startup or product. The lithium era may not end with a dramatic announcement or a sudden replacement. It may fade quietly, reshaped by a technology that simply works better under a different set of rules. And the companies watching most closely already understand what that would mean. The only question now is whether Donut Lab truly built the future of energy storage, or just forced the industry to confront how fragile its assumptions have become.